In this quick lesson, we are going to discuss ambient light. Ambient light is a very simple light that adds an even amount of illumination from every direction. So it's not coming from any particular direction, and also it can be used to create effects like ambient occlusion. Now for this lesson, we are going to be using the same scene that we used for the previous lesson, which was about IS light. So open up 0206 underscore V-Ray underscore IS light from your project folder, and let's continue. As this scene has no light, let me add a very simple sphere light. Set its radius to 15 and unit to watts, and make sure the intensity is about 20 watts. Now we can run V-Ray RT. From the V-Ray toolbar, let's select ambient light and add it anywhere in the scene, as the location and orientation of this light does not matter and it doesn't cast shadows. So the light doesn't cast shadow at all. You can put it wherever you want and the result would be exactly the same. Now let me select the ambient light and let's take a look at its parameters. First, you can turn it on and off using enabled option. Using color, you can define the color of the light. Now let me set it to this purplish color. Intensity controls the overall brightness or intensity of the light. So if I set the intensity maybe to something like 0.1, you can clearly see that we can simply add a tint of any color to our render using ambient light. Let's set the color to the default gray and set the intensity back to 1. Using light map, you can use a map or a texture to control the color of your light. Let's maybe use a checker map here, and you can see the results in the VRT. Okay, let me clear the map and turn off light map. And obviously, using this value that you have beside light map, you can mix the texture with the color up there. So at 100%, at 100 you are only using the texture, and if you use something like 50, you're going to be using 50% of texture and 50% of the color, and mix those two together. Next we have compensate exposure. If you enable it, the defined color here will not be affected by the camera's exposure. Let's select the color here, whatever color, it doesn't matter really. At the moment, compensate exposure is turned off, so if I select my 3ds Max's physical camera and try increasing the exposure value and therefore letting less light into the camera, you can see that color also gets darker and darker. But if I select my ambient light and enable compensate exposure, now you can see the color is back where it was, and if I select my camera again and alter the exposure, you can see that color is the same and the exposure value of the camera is only affecting the rest of the scene and not the color. Now let me set the exposure to 8.5 and select the ambient light again, and let's set its color to the default gray value. Now for the time being, let's set the GI minimum distance to 10 so we can see how this light tries to give us a fake GI or an ambient occlusion effect. Ambient light has 3 modes. When set to direct and GI, the light affects both direct and indirect illumination or indirect lighting or GI. So if I set the mode to direct, the light only affects direct lighting and adds a constant color to the scene. And if set to GI, it only affects GI or indirect lighting. Now GI minimum distance, if I quote chaos group, basically it specifies a distance from object within which the GI rays will not be affected by the ambient light. As I increase this value, you can see how it works. Now let's set it to 10. If I now change the color to pure white and increase the intensity to maybe 5, we would have a proper ambient occlusion path that can be used in compositing to add a bit more detail to the render. even though there are easier ways to render out an ambient occlusion path in V-Ray, but that's how you do it using an ambient light. In this lesson, we talked about V-Ray ambient light. I will see you in the next lesson.